Biology and the Mind, Structure and Function of the Nervous System. This PowerPoint is focused on the peripheral nervous system. So we start from outside in and top to bottom. Remember that the peripheral nervous system is made up of all the remaining nerves outside of the brain and spinal cord. It acts to sense and respond to stimuli both inside and outside the body. First, I will be speaking about the sensory aspect and then go into the motor aspect of the peripheral nervous system. There is a video about the peripheral nervous system that you can go ahead and watch. So when we talk about the peripheral nervous system, again, we'll start with that sensory aspect. And these are afferent nerves, which is tissue that includes both the dorsal root ganglia and the cranial nerve ganglia. It serves to transmit signals toward the spinal cord and brain for a response if the stimuli is strong enough to warrant a response. So in this PowerPoint, we're talking about exteroception, which are the stimuli that comes from outside the body, talking about proprioception, which is stimuli that signals where we are in relation to gravity and how to respond to any changes of certain forces in order to remain in an upright position. And then interoception, which is stimuli that is related to signals coming from inside our organs primarily. So you can kind of think about this when it comes to food that may be contaminated or toxic, also any kind of mental health states, anxiety, fear, depression, stage fright, those kinds of things. All right, so I'll start out with exteroception. This is really defined as the sensitivity to stimuli that are outside the body, resulting from the response of specialized sensory cells called exteroceptors, and they respond to objects and occurrences in the external environment. And, it takes on a variety of forms. Of course, we know about sight and the photoreceptors, which detect color and light, the sense of smell, which are the olfactory receptors that are cranial nerve number 1, which is a direct link to some of those deep centers of our brain. It is closely linked to memory and survival. So if you think about things like the smell of fresh baked bread or cookies or other things that maybe, good memories from going over to a grandparent's house at Thanksgiving or Christmas or some other holiday, but even things like the smell of smoke or fire. Hearing, of course, is the nerves that hear. They take those sound waves and bring them into parts of our brain for us to respond to. But it's also about the cochlea and the semicircular canals that are related to proprioception. Now, when talking about touch, those are the cutaneous receptors, the ones in our skin, and I'll talk about those a little bit more in a bit. Taste, of course, are those receptor cells on our tongue and also in our upper digestive system. And the different areas on our tongue we know through research, salty, sweet, bitter, sour, and then something that's called umami, also known as the sense of taste of savoriness. All right, so proprioception, or the awareness of the soma, and soma meaning body. When we talk about proprioception, this is voluntary or involuntary muscle movement in order to respond to stimuli. So the primary sense receptors include Pacinian corpuscles and the Meissner corpuscles. Now, Pacinian corpuscles are in connective tissue and fascia. The Ruffini's corpuscles are in deep tendons, muscle, tissue, and folds in the skin. And then the Meissner and Merkel endings are primarily in the skin, and those are things that respond to deformation, stretch, compression, curves, and vibration. Interoception is the awareness of internal states. So this is a complex relationship between our nervous system and the body proper. It is responsible for monitoring and regulation. So think about the chemical substances and processes that happen within the body or another organism. There are mechanical forces that are pressures that are things like compression, tensile forces, and then shearing. And then the thermal and electromagnetic signals, hot, cold, light, dark, sound, and then the sensory signals that are at the cranial nerves. The vagus, which will be discussed in another PowerPoint, travels from the deep centers of our brain down to large intestines and subdiaphragmatic. Again, we'll talk about those in another PowerPoint. So with the mechanoreceptors and the chemoreceptors, these are sensory receptors that respond to mechanical forces and or chemical substances. And then the spinal nerve. So there's receptors that respond and signal temperature, pain, and of course tissue injury. So talking about the motor or efferent aspect of the peripheral nervous system, these are signals from the central nervous system. Some of these signals go completely up to the brain for a response, and other signals are responded to at the level of the spinal cord. So it really just kind of depends on the stimuli. But if you think about this, the knee-jerk reflex, that's you hit at the patellar tendon, your body responds to that. It's not something that travels all the way up to your brain and then back down for a reaction. It just happens. So movement here is really based on input, and we've got our voluntary nervous system, which is referred to as the somatic nervous system. And then there's the involuntary, which is about the autonomic nervous system. So these, with the voluntary and the involuntary, we think about muscle tissue, smooth, cardiac, and skeletal are the three different types of muscle tissue that we have in our body. All right, so the autonomic nervous system, the divisions are really functional. They're not necessarily structural. So the autonomic nervous system stimulates cardiac muscle, most glands, and all smooth muscle. The hypothalamus, which is in the diencephalon, talked about in PowerPoint number 1, acts as control and regulation for the autonomic nervous system. So this is divided up into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, of course, most of us know these divisions, but just to go over them again, the sympathetic nervous system uses a lot of energy in the form of glycogen from the liver, and it also uses a great deal of oxygen. It is said to be metabolically active. Its primary chemical transmitter is noradrenaline. So if you think about adrenergic receptors and chemicals, those are the things that respond, that causes the sympathetic nervous system to respond. So the pathway for the sympathetic nervous system innervation is primarily at vertebral levels T1 down through L2. The parasympathetic is really about rest and digest. This is the pathway for innervation is primarily at the nuclei and centers from the brain stem and in the sacral nerve. So primary chemical transmitter is acetylcholine. It is metabolically conservative. There are cholinergic receptors and chemicals that respond and react at the and stimulate that parasympathetic nervous system, helping to do things like lower our heart rate, respiration, and of course digestion, peristalsis. All right, so in summary, the peripheral nervous system is composed of both sensory afferent and motor efferent fibers. The sense organs are specialized to respond to specific stimuli depending upon where they are located at in the body. The motor aspect of the system is there to act upon the stimuli, whether that is external or internal, again, depending on where in the body the stimuli is coming from. And the motor aspect of the nervous system is made up of the somatic or voluntary nervous system, primarily skeletal muscle, and the autonomic or involuntary nervous system with two functional divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches. Here are a couple of videos, and these videos will also show up in a couple of other places. They could be put just about anywhere. They happen to show up here right now. Again, watch them, but they'll show up. It's always good to rewatch them if you've already watched them. Again, lots of different information from different perspectives. And of course, your references.